So with that, welcome, and we'll go over a few housekeeping things, but let's begin with prayer, and Tom will lead us in prayer.
Let's pray. God, we come together this evening to study your word by the means of a technology that none of us, well, most of us probably didn't even know existed just a few years ago. We thank you for the ability to gather this way virtually when we can't gather in person as your church. Be with us tonight. Help open our minds, our eyes, our ears to the way that you communicate with us throughout time. We thank you for your creation and your redemption of this world that we all inhabit. We thank you for your love that surrounds us from the very beginning of our lives. Thank you for the way your word comes to us through scripture, and that you've given us the brains to study it and interpret it in the light of what's happening in our lives today. We thank you for the presence of your Spirit with us, guiding us through this study. And all these things we pray in the name of our Lord and our Savior, who came to be with us and open the way to eternal life, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Beautiful. So what we want to do first is, if you all are willing, we want you to because we're going to be together for 7 weeks in this setting. We want you to know who else is in the room. So we're going to ask you to do this really quickly, to say your name and one little sentence or morsel about why you chose to spend these Thursday nights in this way with us. So Tom and I will end that. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to literally go around and call on either individuals or couples, because there are a couple of couples here to bring that. So I'm going to go around. I hope I don't miss anybody. If I do, call me out on that. But Charlotte and Alan, you are first in my little circle. So could you all introduce yourselves and say why you wanted to do this study?
I'm Charlotte Bath. We've been in Chicago about, 10 to 12 years. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do the study because it amazes me that every time I read something in the Bible again, I find something I didn't find last time, or I see something in a different light. And I already have chapters 1 through 3.
Absolutely.
Great.
So I'm Alan Bath, and I just love Genesis. I love the storytelling. I love the imagery, it's a beautiful book to study.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Judy and Tom. So glad to have both of you.
I'll let Tom tell you first.
Hey,
I'm
Tom.
Tom Monroe, and I'm joining because it's down where we have our TV, and we can't have the TV on and class at the same time.
I love it.
I'm Judy, and in December, and Lucy knows we've been through 2021 has been rough. However, it'll be 48 years, he made me social secretary, and I decided that we needed to get reconnected. I love Lucy's sermons, and Genesis, it took me back to my childhood and looking out the window and up at the sky and just kind of in wonderment and a bit of fear.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Judy. All right, Sylvia, you're on my bottom left or middle left.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sylvia Robertson, and I joined this class because I wanted to hear from Lucy and Tom. And Genesis gets often lost to me. So thank you.
Thank you. That's great. How about you, Alison Thomas?
I'm Alison Thomas, and I'm here because this was billed as Bible study, and as many classes as I've taken in adult ed, I've never really been in a Bible study class.
Huh. Okay.
group. And I have for a long time sort of complained about the little pockets of them through fourth, and mostly it's male or female. And so I'm here for that and looking forward to Genesis.
Yay, thank you, Allison. How about you, Linda?
So I took up part of my time just unmuting. My name is Linda Crane, and I would like to say the same things that Alison Thomas just said. The dearth of Bible classes, and then somebody else said the dynamic duo of the instructors, and so I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Debbie and Craig?
I'm Debbie Kinzer, and excuse me, I like Bible study, like a couple other people said, and I also like to hear different perspectives, because I've read Genesis so many times, and I've been to other courses that addressed it, so I really want to hear what your perspective is.
And how about you, Craig?
I just recently attended by Zoom a similar study of Revelation, and since I usually do things upside down, having done the end, I thought maybe I'd go back to the beginning and see where it all came from.
Okay. Great, thank you. Meg O'Hara?
I have not done Bible studies since early high school. So
Wow,
I know.
that's amazing.
Yeah. I used to be so engaged with it and haven't been since then. So I owe it to Kathy Beenan, who said she wanted to do this to reconnect with Tom and Lucy. And I thought, that's a great idea. And I wanted to get to know the dynamic duo as you're now.
Oh, Lord. Okay. We'll see how dynamic we are a duo. That's great, thank you. How about you, Joy Anderson?
That's a tall billing you and Tom have, Lucy.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not very tall either, so there we
Yeah,
go.
that's true. My name is Joy Anderson, and like many others have said, I was actually looking forward to reconnecting with a small group, getting to be with the same people for a period of weeks, and the book of Genesis, I was just curious to talk about and think about how that applies to our life today, and particularly some of the, I don't want to say contradictions, but some of the difficult parts in Genesis, how we might wrestle with them.
Great, thank you. That's a great lead-in. Margaret?
Hi, I'm Margaret Lang. I've been in lots of different classes in the decades I've been at Forth, but rarely one focusing on Genesis. I don't remember one specifically about Genesis, so I figured it was about time. And this just appealed to me as what to do as the back to school kind of timing. So here I am back in class.
Yay, great, glad. Kathy Beenan.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kathy Beenan, and I was attracted for echo a lot of what you said. I haven't done a Bible study for years, and I kind of like the idea, the rigor of spending several weeks. And Genesis, I'm attracted to anything that starts within the beginning. It seems like an excellent linear progression, and it covers a lot of ground. I had the privilege of knowing Tom as one of my pastors for a number of years in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I do know that people have always enjoyed his teaching, and I have as well. And so again, it's to connect with a group from Forth. It's to see Lucy and Tom again, and it's to kind of reignite the Bible study in my life.
Fantastic. So good to have you. Kelly.
What you all said. I have always been fascinated by Genesis. It's my favorite chapter in the Bible. And I have a lot of questions that I want to ask God and about this chapter, the beginning. So I'm hoping we can address some of those questions in the class.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. Marilyn.
Well, I'm here because I absolutely hate Genesis. It's unscientific, it's stupid, it's politically incorrect, and I just want to study it more to see what you all have to say about the implications of it. Because I really hate it.
Yep. Well, we had that conversation outside on Sunday, and I said, bring that question and that comment into the circle, because I do think it's really important to realize that very complicated, the Bible is complicated, and this particular book in the Bible is really complicated. So we'll be waiting for all of your insight and perspective. But thank you, Marilyn, for bringing that forward. So we'll see where we go. Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Pond, and I'm taking this class because I always take every Bible study class. I like studying the Bible, and that's it.
Excellent. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you all for your candor and for your energy. And we hope we will not bore you with this. So Tom and I will introduce ourselves. Tom, do you want to go?
Sure.
Introduce yourself?
So I'm Tom Forster Smith. I'm married to Lucy. Lucy and I met 1,000 years ago at Princeton Theological Seminary when we both were new students there. And that was like in the mid-1970s. So we go back quite a long way. I've been mostly involved in parish ministry throughout my career, though we did spend 8 years of our early ministry working together as campus ministers at the University of Washington in Seattle. I've served congregations in Cincinnati, in Milwaukee, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Kathy refers to the House of Hope Presbyterian Church and Central Presbyterian Church is both in St. Paul. And then I did some interims in our years in the Boston area. And then we moved here January 1st, 2018. I've been involved here in the men's Bible studies that are now meeting online by Zoom, and enjoy those 2 weekly groups that I'm in. I've enjoyed teaching the Bible in these various different settings. Also, I've done some prison ministry and have led some Bible studies behind bars. And that's very interesting kind of work. You never know quite what perspective people have from various different walks of life. So I learn something each time I do it. And I'm looking forward to learning with you guys in this class.
Thanks. And I'm Lucy. I know everybody in this circle, and I'm delighted to be able to, I know you, but I don't know you, if you would say. I've been at Forth almost 4 years. In January, I will be 4 years. I was basically voted in about 4 years ago next week, so by you all. And one of my responsibilities is to work with adult education. And I can think of no other way that I would rather do my work than to be able to really learn with you. And I really mean that, not teach you as much as learn with you what God is saying to us through scripture. And so that's largely why we're doing this class. Tom and I will do this class this semester or this term. And then in the spring, we'll probably do one of the Gospels. So that's what we're not going to go to Revelation, sorry, unless somebody absolutely can't stand it and really wants a
Been there,
whole
done that.
Revelation 7 weeks, but I think we'll probably go to a Gospel. So anyway, let's move forward then. We're already behind, Tom. So we're going to really work. So I'm going to just show you, if I can, real fast. I'm going to share my screen just for a minute. We're not going to do a lot of screen sharing with these classes because I would rather see you than to see things on a screen like that. But I do want to do this right away, just so that you can see what we're planning to do here. So let me get this into the play from the start. Here we go. So that's the first one. That's just in the beginning, a study of Genesis, you can see. So with this, we just want to give you the really fast course outline. So tonight is October 7th. We will be doing the introductory work, looking primarily at the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And we really hope that you will, as we give you these assignments of reading, like Margaret is talking about, class readings, that you will read them. You don't have to read them and do all the commentary work and kind of go, go out on the internet and find out all the intensive things about it. But it is helpful to have at least a sweep, because we're going to go through the entire 50 chapters of Genesis. So this week, we asked you to read the first 3 chapters. We're not going to gild anybody if you didn't get to it. Please don't, we won't do that. But it would be helpful just in the way of being able to be prepared. And next week, it's even going to be more. We're going to ask you to read 7 chapters, the next 7. And then, as you can see, there's titles. What we'll do is I'm going to send this course outline to you online. So you'll have that. So everybody will have it in front of you. You can see where we're going. But all the way through until November 18th, which is our last week. And we will be culminating with the end of Joseph narrative. So, and then do a conclusion. So that's where that is right now.
Lucy, did you want to mention that you and I are using the new Revised Standard Version?
Yeah. You can mention that.
Okay, so consider it mentioned. It's a good version. It's an inclusive language, and yet it takes very seriously the original texts from Hebrew. So it's, of course, the version that Fourth Presbyterian has in pews and refers to a lot. But if you are someone who really loves another version, you're welcome to use whatever version you like, with one exception. No Living Bible.
Why is that?
I say that simply because the Living Bible is not actually a translation from Hebrew. It's a paraphrase in English. So though it is easy to read, it's not particularly accurate in catching a lot of the nuance of the original language that these scriptures are written in. So please use your Living Bibles for other things at other times, but don't rely on that for this study.
All right, well, let's launch then. Thank you, Tom, for that. And I think it might be helpful for you to kind of know where we're going. We're with kind of a structure of what we plan to do this evening. A lot of this evening is going to be giving you a sense of how the Bible was actually, how the book of Genesis specifically, but how particularly the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were constructed, or where the sources were that they came from. Now, why is that important? It's important because sometimes there's some misunderstanding about how the Bible was written, or there's an assumption that the Bible was just sort of a different version of the same stories that were being floating around at the time in history that it was happening. So, you may look at a bunch of creation narratives and myths from a range of backgrounds and traditions, all the way from Native American traditions to Indian, from India traditions to ancient Middle East traditions that had their own creation or how did the world come into being kind of stories. But even as we look further on down into the narrative that begins in chapter 12 of Genesis, again, the way that those stories came together and were put together, I think it's really important if we're going to do a study of these texts to have a sense of where did this come from and how did it come from and what were the different contributing traditions, if you will, or understandings that were there. So again, we're kind of doing this at a pretty we want to challenge you with this material. So it's going to be a little bit more, not quite seminary, but kind of getting toward that in the way of a lot of background. And if you feel lost or it's sort of like, why are they doing all this? Please jot your questions down. But one of the things I would prefer not to do in this is to use the chat function in terms of taking your questions. And that's only because what'll happen is I'll be looking over at the chat and somebody writing, and then we'll get all sidetracked or we'll be moving into a particular question. So my preference would be for you to have somewhere to write. You have a question to write it down, and you can send that to Tom and me anytime after this evening, and we will address it, pick it up in the following week. Okay, does that work for folks? I don't want to offend anybody, but I also think it's just the chat function can be very hard to try and so anyway. So I want to just begin with a very a kind of quick overview of a beginning talking about authorship, and then Tom will pick this up. So we are focusing on Genesis. The book of Genesis is 50 chapters, but the first 11 chapters are considered prehistory. Now, this may come as a surprise to people who believe, for example, in not necessarily you all, but maybe some of you do have heard this, the whole thing about 7-day creation, and there was really a flood, and there really was Sodom and Gomorrah, and there really were other things that show up in those early narratives. But scholars really believe, and in the way that the Bible was, particularly I'm going to talk about Genesis, put together, the first 11 chapters were prehistory. So not necessarily, kind of mythology. There's some other things going on here in these chapters. It's not just sort of a myth that you say, well, isn't that a sweet story? But on the other hand, and it's very important. I'm not diminishing the importance of it, but it really is understood to be prehistory. Chapter 12, which begins with the call of Abram, who becomes Abraham, begins what we talked about in seminary as the Heilsgeschichte. That is a German word that essentially means the salvation history. So in chapter 12, when we get there, the third week of our study, and on through the rest of the entire narrative of Genesis, it will be dealing with what we would say is truly history in the way that we as people understand chronology. You can locate it at a particular time in a particular place. All right, so then a little bit more on how this prehistory really got pulled together, as well as the rest of the narrative of Genesis. Prior to any written version, there were many centuries when the saga of Israel's earliest history was transmitted orally by word of mouth, one generation of Israelites to the next. As a matter of fact, very few people were able to read. The priests and the scholars were, and so the oral transmission of stories was the primary way that faith was conveyed. So as we're reading this, keep that in mind, that this is an oral compilation of many generations of telling the story over and over again. I was saying to Tom when we were working on this material that in some ways, this is a lot like the rabbinic the rabbinic way of understanding reading text, because the way that the rabbis do, you read a text, but then they do a lot of insertion and assertion and wondering about what the text means. And it's almost like they continue to write the story. So it's really interesting that that's kind of the roots of where we've come from. So when it finally got written down, Genesis was written primarily to serve as a prelude to Exodus, the story of God's definitive history with the Hebrew people. Thus, it's viewed as prehistory of the world through the lens of the Exodus liberation. Now, you all know what the Exodus is, right? I mean, when the Hebrew people were slaves, and then God called Moses to go down or to go and deliver them from captivity through the Red Sea, Red Sea, into the wilderness to the promised land. So you'll hear some of those themes show up in Genesis, but really it's sort of like moving us into Exodus. And we're not going to go to Exodus in a study. You may ask for it, and we could do it, but we won't be doing that here. So then it's not to be read as factual history, but as an authoritative interpretation of God's beneficent involvement in the creation of life and the direction of Israel culture. Let me read that one more time. It's not to be read as factual history, but as an authoritative interpretation of God's involvement with humanity in the creation of all of life. And it directs, and then it moves in the direction of creating and calling a people as God's beloved. So God is the protagonist. That means God is the primary actor in Genesis. And the human characters of Adam and Eve through Joseph, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are the subjects of God's activity. This is admittedly a very Judeo-centric version of human history, and it really shows little regard for other ethnic groups or cultures, except as they basically animate and open the way for what's happening in the Jewish culture. Okay, so I know that was a lot to kind of throw at you quickly, but the main idea was it's oral history that is compiled over a very long time. So Tom's going to now go into a little bit more of the literary criticism, and I am going to actually quickly pull a slide up for you. Wait a minute. Oops. Okay, I'm going to do that. Hold on.
While Lucy is getting that teed up, so who among us here, you can show your hand if you want, believes that the Bible was written by the hand of God, a la Cecil B. DeMille? Okay. One. Okay. Lucy, you getting that slide?
I'm getting it. Hold on.
Okay.
There we go.
Do you remember in the movie The Ten Commandments where there's this like lightning bolt that comes down and zaps the Hebrew letters into the stone tablets? That would give you an idea of a visual idea of, there we go. The concept that it was God who directly actually wrote the Bible word by word by this big divine hand coming down out of the clouds and zapping the stone tablets. So, okay, Lucy, thank you. You can now remove
Bye-bye.
the visual.
Okay.
That said, most biblical scholars these days believe that that was not the case. That's not how the Bible came to be. Even that the traditional belief that Moses himself was the author of the first 5 books of what we've come to know as the book, of the Bible, is not the case. Moses probably didn't even know how to write. So traditionally, the first 5 books, including Genesis, have been called the books of Moses, but he didn't write them. In fact, probably these first 5 books, which are called the Pentateuch, And if you know Greek or Latin, you'll know the derivation of Pentateuch, 5, and Tuch, essentially books, were not written down until beginning in about 1000 BC, which is during the reign of King David in Israel, in ancient Israel. Prior to that, as Lucy said, these were all just floating around in oral tradition. And that was really the way that people communicated ongoing stories in those days. Hardly anybody read, just the priests and some scholars. So if you're going to convey a faith story, you're going to have to do it orally for the masses. But for the intelligentsia, starting about 1000 BC, the Pentateuch, what we have come to know as the Pentateuch, began to be written. We've come also to know those first 5 books of the Bible as, in the Hebrew word, the Torah, which many of us think means the law, because in Exodus, certainly the law is given, Exodus being the second book of the Pentateuch. Torah does actually not mean law in Hebrew, it means teaching. So the Torah, or the Pentateuch, is the teaching in traditional Hebrew thought. Now, if you begin to dissect apart the Pentateuch or any section of the Bible, you're participating in what's called literary criticism, saying, now, wait a minute, this wasn't all written at the same time. In fact, this was written over a long period of time and written by different authors. How do we know? How can we tell? How can scholars decipher what is that, how this is different? Well, they do it by a number of different methods, by vocabulary being used, by literary style, by events that are being referred to in the narrative that obviously happened at very different time periods. So all these are clues that, hey, this was not zapped into stone by the hand of God. This was written by human beings in different circumstances, in different time frames. And so we come around to the Pentateuch, and we've got 4 different themes and time frames going on in what we've got written. So Genesis, of course, being one of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, is part of all this. So scholars outline 4 different literary strands in the Pentateuch, and they identify them by the first letter of the name that they've given each of these strands. The first one is called the J strand, or source, let's call it source. The J, letter J, source, which is called the Yahwist source. Well, why J? That sounds like a Y to me. Well, in Hebrew and in other languages like German, for instance, J is pronounced like a Y. So Yahweh is the name that's used for God in this earliest written source material of the Pentateuch. I think it was written about 950 BC in the United Kingdom of Israel. If you remember, if you've taken Old Testament history before, you remember that Israel was a united country under only really 2 kings. And for a short time, King David, around 1000 BC, and his son, King Solomon, 920 BC, 950 BC. And then it split apart into a northern and a southern kingdom. But the Yahwist source is the source of the creation story that's found in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. It's the older version of that story, but it is placed second for some reason. Maybe we'll get into that. And it contains a mythic account of the prehistory of Israel, including what Lucy was referring to as the epic of the patriarchs, starting in chapter 12, the life of Abraham, who, if you can identify him as a historic character, they believe he would have lived around 1800 BC, down through his, let's see, his great-grandson, Joseph. Remember Joseph in Egypt, and Joseph would have lived around 1700 BC. And then it continues on, this strand, the Yahwist source continues on even into the Exodus story, on beyond what we're going to consider in this class. The Exodus from Egypt, they best can date that historically, if it was a historic event, around 1300 BC. And this source views creation and all subsequent history as a theocentric act of divine grace. That means God's at the center. As Lucy said, God's the protagonist. It's God doing and people responding. God promises blessing to all of humanity through the nation of Israel. Israel's going to be the vehicle of that blessing to the whole world. And humans' role is to respond to God and to be the stewards of the creation and to believe in what God's promising to them and then acting on this faith. Abraham is viewed as the model human being in this Yahweh strand because he obediently follows the directive of God to leave what he's known and go off into the wilderness in search of a land that will be promised, is being promised to him and his descendants. Okay.
So
I
do you
spent a
want to
lot of
just
time on that.
do one other tradition
Yep.
tonight, and we can
Okay.
swing back by to those because
Okay.
we really
The
want to
second
get
one.
to the text. So go ahead. Yeah,
The
please.
E source or Elohist source, written about 100 years later than the Yahwist source, written about 850 BC in what had then split and had become the northern and southern kingdom. This was a source written in the northern kingdom of Israel. It uses the Hebrew word Elohim to refer to God, and that's whereas the Yahweh source uses the term Yahweh. Yahweh is given to Moses as the name of God, but Elohim shows up in this source. And Elohim actually is a plural form of a noun in Hebrew, and alludes to a time prior to this when the understanding of God may not have been entirely monotheistic, but they believed perhaps in multiple gods. They came eventually to believe in one God, but they were still referring to God as Elohim, as plural. And you may remember there are passages in this that refer to God and speaking to other heavenly beings in the heavenly court. Who are these people? Are they angels? Are they, what are they? We don't know, but they seem to be there in the background of what's being written about. Also, a lot of the Abraham and Isaac portion of the narrative is from the Elohist source. It's often hard to distinguish it theologically from the Yahweh source, but its vocabulary, like Elohim, is what gives it away. Quickly, there are two more sources. They don't really show up much in Genesis. The Deuteronomist source. There we go. It was written about 650 BC in the southern kingdom, not the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, prior to the fall of Jerusalem when the Babylonians invaded and destroyed Israel and took some of the people into exile. This was a theologically unique source in that it stressed, obey God and you will live. disobey God, and you're toast. It's pretty scary stuff. It shows up and to a much larger degree later in the Pentateuch, in Leviticus, and particularly in Deuteronomy, which is named for it. Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law, and that's a Greek word, Deuteronomy. The last one quickly is the priestly source, and that was written during the Babylonian exile, when there was no country of Israel anymore, in about 550 BC. But the priests held together the tradition of Judaism during that time. And this strand is really very liturgical in its nature. And we'll see in Genesis chapter 1, which we're going to get to in a moment, that the first creation story is actually the last one written. It's from the priestly source, again, written about 550 BC. And its style is very much more laid out, like you could chant it in a worship service, rather than just a narrative story, an epic saga. It's highly structured. And also, both two other things. In the Elohist source material and in the priestly source material, there is not so much a concept of God as being an involved, compassionate human being. God is more removed. God is more distant and less directly involved in the day-to-day workings of creation, and communicates not necessarily directly with people, but through angels, through these other divine beings. So all of that is at play here, and we'll see more of it as we go along. Lucy?
So now we're going to quickly move to the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And what I'm going to do in preparation to getting you into some small groups. So Alan, there's going to be a cue in just a minute. Matter of fact, I'll do that in a second.
Make me host if you wouldn't mind.
I will. And I can do that actually right this second, just to make sure we get that done. All right. Do I click on you with more? And then I make you, whoops, make host. Okay. So Alan's going to be the host going forward. But what I'd like to do is I am just going to, number one, I would like to know, show of hands, how many of you realize there were 2 creation stories in the book of Genesis?
We did.
Some knew, some didn't. It's fine. I mean, it's not big. There are 2 creation stories. And as Tom has laid out, those creation stories come from very different backgrounds and different traditions. So the first creation story is what we think of as the kind of, and God said it and it was good all the way through. And it's very liturgical. You could almost think of it as a chant that God created something, pronounced it good. God created something, pronounced it good. And so it's almost like a liturgical form of what you might do on a Sunday morning in a call and response, or call and, call to worship in your response. So that part, though, that first creation story is seen in Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, the first half of the 4th verse. Then starting in chapter 2, verse 4b through the end of chapter 3 is the second creation story. Now, I think what happens, and maybe some of the reason, Marilyn, why you really don't particularly love even this part of it, though maybe you just don't like the whole book, but this is that a lot of people merge those 2 stories together. But what's very interesting, I just want to lay out some contrasting things that happen in the 2 different stories really fast. I've got about 6 different things that are different in the 2, just so you can start thinking about what you just read in 1 through 3 and what's the difference. So first of all, as Tom said, the liturgical form in the first story is almost like a chant. It's like, God said it, it happened, pronounce it good. And then when we get to the end, God did it, created the humans, and it was very good. And what happened on the 7th day, God rested. That is that first creation story. The second creation story is about God's relationship to humans. And it is a very, what we would call, not a creation-centered kind of story in the sense of the whole of creation, including the stars and the moon and all of it, but it really is about God's relationship to humans, which is at the center. So we would call it anthropomorphic, centered on human beings, okay? Other things that are going on that are different. Number of days are 7 days in the first story. In the second story, almost everything takes place on the sixth day, of what we would call the sixth day of creation, when human beings are formed. And it begins with God scooping up the dust of the earth and creating Adam, which in a way really means Adam is not necessarily a gendered man, but it's really human being. And then
Big Yiddish, a mensch.
a mensch. Okay, so it begins with God creating from the dust the man, and then on through the creation narrative, and who is created last, the woman. And the woman is not seen in the way that scholars understand this as somehow an afterthought, but actually the divine, sort of most amazing thing that could have happened. So you're going to hear my little feminist edge on some of this, because I've done a lot of reading of these texts through a feminist lens. And if you don't want, I won't put a lot of that in there, but truly the scholarly understanding is that it is sort of the ultimate of creation. God's final masterpiece would be the creation of woman as the partner to the man. So as we said earlier, the names of God are different. So if you read it in the original Hebrew, the first narrative, the first chapter or the first story would be using this Elohim language for God, plural. God is seen as transcendent, sovereign, universal.
Let us make humans in our own image.
Yeah.
Who's God talking to?
Yeah, we're talking, yeah, what? We thought it was one God. In the second, God is used, the term is Yahweh, and is one God. And the assumption in this one God is that it's personal, immanent, and close. So Elohim, far distant God, here, image of God, personal, immanent, close. The manner of creation is different. In the first story, the creation is done by the word of God. God speaks the world into being. In the second, God creates human beings by taking dust, forming it from the ground, and literally the word is kissing the man into life. That would preach. And women, again, are final masterpiece. So it's like, though taken from the man, it's not good for him to be alone, and the woman is created. There is no Garden of Eden in the first narrative. Read it, check me. There is no Garden of Eden in the first narrative. And the second narrative is almost totally centered on the Garden of Eden, both where the people show up and what goes on there, and then they are banished from the garden. Again, the creation of humans in the first one, woman and man are created in the image of God at the same time. And they are created last. In the second story, man is created first, woman second. They're taken, the woman is taken from the man, but they are seen as partners together. There's an emphasis on Adam needing a partner, emphasis on the two becoming one flesh in marriage, and underscoring the institution of marriage. Then finally, just real quickly, 3 themes show up in both of them in different order in each story. In the first one, there is God mentions in God's speeches to the first couple issues of sex, issues of work, and issues of food. So, the issues of what is the role of sex, be fruitful and multiply, and this whole kind of blessing of the beauty of the creative act of human sexuality, and then work, is the second one. And then the third is about food and, tending the garden and that kind of thing. In the second story, it has these themes, but they're in a different order: work, food, and the intimate relationship, in this case, between women and men for the procreative act. Okay. So again, for our GLBTQ IA partners, people that are of same-sex relationships and engaged with each other in that way. Again, that is not in these texts in that way. It's been actually used as a pretty upsetting thing for a lot of people, in assuming that man and woman is the normative, is the way it has to be, and any other is not there. But I think it's just, in many ways, this is really about sexuality as procreation. And man, do we see this throughout this whole book of Genesis, the importance of progeny, of carrying forward this intensive desire for a future together that is born out of children. So I would like to get us in groups. If you are willing to have a little tiny bit over 8 o'clock in this night, and every other week we will stop at 8, but I'd like for us to be able to do 10 minutes in small groups and then come back together again and close. So can we do that?
Lucy, may I make one suggestion?
Sure.
We give them one question to discuss in the small groups.
All
Our
right.
second one, not our
Okay.
first.
Great. So your question, when you get in small groups, we're going to put you in groups of 4 or 5 people, will be, what do you find affirming and or disturbing in these stories? Affirming and disturbing in these stories. All right.
Okay, so can I let it rip?
Let her rip.
Okay,
Thank you.
so you're invited to join.
Oh, so people should be disappearing. from
So
the screen.
I have to get into group 2 somehow. So Lucy, are you gonna go into a group?
Tom and I are not going to. So is somebody really down on a group?
Well, I'm gonna join into group 2.
Okay,
So I don't know, how do I
Tom
do
and I
that?
won't. We'll just.
Yeah, I didn't need to make that clear, so that's fine. I'm gonna join 2. We'll see you in a bit.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Bye. Okay. A lot of material, too much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can they hear us?
No. No, they're
is
in their
just
group,
between
and we're in our group, but no, I don't think so. I hope not.
I think we're doing okay. We're just gonna run over time a little bit. Yeah. I could have done a bit more, but that's all right.
You could have what?
Done a bit more with the 4 sources.
Yeah, it just was getting too long. I think, I don't know. I don't know if people can absorb kind of what, it'll become more clear in the future why it's important to know that they come from that. But I think the main point was really trying to get people to understand that this was, compilation and not just kind of written by the hand of God. When you asked that question, did somebody raise their hand saying they thought it was written by God's hand?
Laura.
Whoa.
Laura.
Okay.
Yeah. What's I gonna say? Do we want to address the issue of, so why does the Bible give us 2 different stories? What mindset would juxtapose 2 very different stories and say, okay, you're getting both of them?
What is the reason?
I don't know. Although that's true in the Bible throughout, is that it's a compilation of material that some of it's contradictory to other parts of what's shown, but
yeah,
they put them both there. It's like different facets of a diamond.
Well, it could be parallel to my story is my story and your story is your story, and they're not the same, but we're both humans.
Like, why are there 4 gospels instead of just one?
Yeah, exactly. It's different perspectives, different people bringing different things in. Yep.
Didn't
just-
seem-
I
They
hope
didn't
that
seem
people aren't-
to, they didn't seem, the people who put together the canon didn't seem to be concerned with mutually exclusive approach to things. They just put it all in.
Yeah.
There's no exceptions.
Well, I mean, tonight was pretty technical, and I was trying to indicate that we're going to do some more, more kind of biblical background tonight, but the rest of it will be more kind of digging into the actual text and, what's happening there. So I don't know. Yeah, it could be okay. Ugh.
So who's going to
Takes a
pull
lot
the
of
plug on the
energy.
small groups?
Huh?
Who's going to pull the plug on the small groups?
He is, Alan.
Okay, he's got a time.
They're 10 minutes. They're in there 10 minutes. So it's only been about 3. So got a little ways to go. Uh-oh. Can see your message. I'm going to get rid of the recording now. I wonder if I can. I think I can. Whoops, he has to give me permission to close the recording. So I'll have to ask Ellen. I don't know why we couldn't do co-host. That's so weird. I don't know.
So
Anyway.
is everything that we're saying now also in the recording?
He'll have to end the recording. Yeah.
I said it's our dialogue together here.
Yeah.
These couple minutes also being recorded.
Yes, it is. This is the only thing that's being recorded. But this can all be cut out. We're not obviously putting this on the thing. Nobody wants to see us sitting here processing the whole thing. So yeah, I hope they're getting into this a little bit, because I think they were sort of sitting there kind of beginning to go, oh geez, it's getting to be pretty pretty technical. Yeah. And I think it is important to get that kind of context, because and it's probably not what people are getting a lot of when they're doing Bible study. You tend to kind of do passages, and kind of what's the meaning for my life. And
well, I think we'll get more into that with the narrative the next couple weeks.
Yeah. It'll be fun. I mean, it's a good group. 6 people didn't show.
Yeah. That's quite a amount.
Whoever that Beatrix was. And let's see.
And Hackney.
Who? Yeah, Penn didn't show. Where the heck's he? Judith Kramer didn't show. Lynn Niels was supposed to join by phone and she didn't. Mary's here. Liz Carroll, she wasn't here. Charlotte Beth and Annette wasn't here. It's weird.
I think I counted 16 people, not including us.
Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, but that's fine. I mean, that's kind of what I wanted. I didn't necessarily need massive, but I
that's
huge
about
help.
right size.
Huh?
That I think 16 is about a good size.
Yeah, I'm going to send a note to all the people that weren't here tonight and just say we missed you, and we hope you can join us next week, because why not? I mean, so are you going to just ask them for one point that came up for them? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And we may have lost some people because people might have some television show or something that they need to go watch. And so, yeah. So I will send out the bibliography, or not bibliography, the class outline. And I will also send out the Beekner sermon. Do you think we should send out the JEDP too, or no?
No.
Okay. But I thought that was interesting. One more minute. I thought that was interesting because, just by the sweep of history and to realize that that very first story was not even really compiled or put together until people were in exile. Yeah, so that's really, really interesting to me.
Well, if Abraham lived around 1800 BC, none of this was written for another 800 years until Yahwist, the Yahwist source.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So 800 years of oral transmission prior to any written transmission.
Yep, it's really fascinating. We should be coming back pretty soon now. So if you could just pick it up and really push that, just kind of one idea from each group, that would be helpful. I think that we need to, have them close that way and then
give them their assignment.
Give them their assignment again. Chapters. We should probably, anyway. Hi.
Welcome back.
Laura, were you in a group by yourself? Oh, you're muted. Sorry, you're muted. Laura, you're muted.
Just one technical glitch. It forced me to do 5 minutes, and I could not, for the life of me, find the time. How to get 10. But anyway.
Okay, well that's fine. That's really good for tonight. We hope you got it. Hope you got a little bit.
Teacher, he knows 2 5s are 10.
Yeah, exactly.
How many people were in your groups?
4 in ours.
We had 4 in ours, and I
Okay,
tried to get the
great.
double people, split around.
Excellent. Okay.
So
let's do a real quick cap.
We want to have someone from each group say what was one thing that your group found particularly noteworthy or interesting together.
I'll go real quick. We have much more on the affirming than the disturbing. Like landslide, 9-1 kind of thing.
That's good for 4 people. 9 to 1.
Well, in terms
the
of the
beauty
idea.
of the creation, we like the way it's described and how beautiful creation still is, and just the way it's described as being good. It was good. It was good. It is good.
Interesting.
Okay, thanks. How about the next group?
Looks like Allison's back. Were you in that same group?
I was with Marilyn and Joy.
Oh, great. Okay.
And we wrestled with Marilyn's struggle with the sort of human-centric, human dominant place where at least this takes us. And Joy and I think, could see the poetry and the, the bigger sort of struggle of humans figuring out who they are and what their place is and what the relationship is with God is sort of the frame, really.
Interesting.
Thanks, Allison. Another group. Yeah, Judy.
I'll go for our group. We discussed the idea, Meg brought up, she had the revised, we have the new, of partner versus helpmate and how that's affected many churches. But we ended with that and agreed that we like the first creation story better because all was right with the world. The second creation story with that lovely snake coming out of the grass is kind of disconcerting. And it was reassuring is how we ended our group, that all the first creation story, all's right in the world. And that we find reassuring nowadays.
Comforting.
You know, one piece of that I want to just say again, Tom and I were in our own little group, but we were talking about the fact that that first creation story was really written out of the context of the Babylonians in exile. And so if you think about that, that assurance, that kind of all is good, all is well, that kind of moment, it's just, there's something powerful to me about realizing when that was written down and to whom. So anyway, go ahead.
Last group, if we had 4 groups.
All right, I'll jump in.
Okay.
Like I said, I thought this was affirming and disturbing. That right away, you saw Adam and Eve with real human traits and flaws that we see today, blaming someone else, you know, don't do this. And so that to me is human, real human beings. But I did find it disturbing that we didn't read about them having this wonderful, lovely relationship in life, like right from the get-go it started. They betrayed God's trust in each other. So I don't know if that's how everybody else looked at it a little differently, but.
Yep.
So flawed right from the beginning.
Yes, why did God do that?
Yeah.
Could have made him a little better, but.
Yeah.
It seemed real to me in that story.
Interesting, and it's so confusing the way that they placed them in Genesis. So what we were referring to as the first story actually was written much, much later than the second. The second is about 400 years, written 400 years before the first, the one that shows up in chapter 1. So maybe there's some hope to, see, well, okay, they started out thinking things are a mess, but the last one written was much more hopeful in its view.
Yeah. Well, I think what you all have said, did we cover all the groups? I think there were 4 reporting back, right? Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. I love your hand signals. So I think what you were just saying, Kelly, is really true. And I think we're going to see this throughout this entire book, that there is this sense of trying to get things right at the beginning, and then something kind of flips out. And there's kind of like the created order and then alienation. Created order, alienation. And what is the role of God in all of that is always seeming to call people back to relationship with God. No matter how far out we get, you're being called back again and again and again. So one of you in the introductory time did say something like, well, how is this relevant to us today? And I think it is fascinating to see the pattern that existed how many years ago, Tom? Like thousands of years ago in the very beginning, if we believe that this is a narrative that takes us back to a very, very immediate time, way thousands of years ago. You just begin to see how it continues to creation, alienation, being called back in relationship again. So
God creates and God redeems. So creates it good, but it gets screwed up in the process, and then God steps in again and redeems.
So does this sound like worship on Sunday morning with confession and assurance? And now we're in relationship with one another again. You break it, you assure it, and then this is all, it's so theologically written. So anyway, let's not get too far out in that. So very grateful for your attention tonight. Tonight is the most technical of anything we will do in the entire study, but we also wanted to help you know kind of how it is that the evolution, if you will, quote unquote, of the way that these stories have evolved. They really arrived over how many year period, Tom?
So we're just thinking while you guys are in a small group, if the Yahwist source, which is the oldest one, was not written until about 1000 BC, and by archaeology, they determined that Abraham, or at least the culture in which the story of Abraham is set, must have taken place around 1800 BC. That's 800 years between the time of Abraham and that any of this got written down. So it was orally transmitted for 800 years before any written attempt was made to enshrine it in writing. That's quite a bit.
So there's something that can blow your mind, you know, in
Yeah.
terms of what 800 years does to a narrative.
A story.
A story. And the other thing to kind of leave with you tonight is, why do you think there were two creation stories? What was that?
Now, why
about?
does the Bible, as we have it now, why does the Bible give us two versions? Why not just one?
Yeah. Yep.
But they
So
seem
there's
to
another
put them
question.
both there.
Yeah.
So that one, you can go out and find your answer out on the internet, but be really careful where you go in the internet, because there's some really, really crazy stuff out there. So next week, we will be reading chapters 4 to 11. If you didn't get a chance to read the first 3, go ahead and read those before next week. 4 to 11 really covers a tremendous number of stories. And we'll give you a lot more time. I'm going to next week really give you 2 breakout sessions to look at these narratives. So, but give you a lot of material about where it's going. So this week, you have that assignment. I also will be sending you the outline of the class to let you know all of the different weeks that we're going to have and what the stories are. I also will be sending you a sermon by Frederick Buechner on Noah's Ark. That's just sort of a fun read. So you'll enjoy that. It's just a little short, it's like a couple pages, but he's really good. And I love the way that he brings kind of the narrative of the ark to life. So I'll send those out to you. Be looking for those as attachments. Marilyn, you have a question.
Yeah, I was wondering how much of Genesis is in the Torah?
All of Genesis is in the Torah.
So, do we know the Jewish author?
It's a bunch of them.
Yeah, there's at least 4
sources, but then those sources were compiled and put together by probably
Who was the
hundreds
editor?
of
Maybe
years.
your question is, who was the editor?
Are
So
you talking about
the form of the Pentateuch that we now have was assembled around 400 BC. So roughly 100, 150 years after the last source was written, they said, okay, and it was a priestly council that would have, said, we're using these traditions and we're putting them together this way. So what we know today as the Pentateuch, or in Judaism, the Torah, was assembled in its present form about 400 BC.
We'll give you a lot more time going forward as well to do some question and answer like that. We didn't mean to silence you tonight. And the recording is still on, and we'll cut out all this last part. But, but we didn't mean to be talking at you as much, but we wanted to make sure that you got just kind of some foundational pieces. And going forward, it'll be much more dialogical, and you'll have much more time to engage us in questions, as well as probe deeper into each of the texts. So just assuring you that it's not going to be all just us telling, but we'll invite your perspectives. So anyway, thank you for going over for the additional 15 minutes. And from here on out, we'll do the best we can to keep it. It's a lot of material. If you have questions during the week about anything, you know my email address. Just if you don't, go on the Fourth Church website. You can find me and pop me a note. Or Tom, you don't know Tom, so we'll keep him in the background on that stuff. And I'm glad to listen and hear what you have to say. But thank you all so much. Very excited. And if you know of other folks that want to pick it up on the second week, that'll be the last time. The last week will really open it to additional people. There's some people who were supposed to be here tonight. I'll pop them a note, see if they can join us next week. But I love the size of it. It's really great. So anyway, not having huge. So anyway, thank you all, and blessings on the rest of your week.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you, Alan.